What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. Illinois is up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Illinois did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Illinois. My projection for this team was 5-7, and then my prediction for them was 4-8. So, as you can tell by my projection and prediction, I was not high on this Illinois team. A lot of people were not really that high on this Illinois team either. But this team proved me wrong. They went 9-3 last year in the regular season, but 10-3 overall if you count their bowl game victory over South Carolina. So yeah, this Illinois team was probably close to being one of the most surprised teams in the country last year. They weren't really at number one, but they were at least in the top 5, at least as surprise teams. So that is what they did last year in 2024. This was their schedule from last year in 2024 as well. And again, they were 9-3. They had a pretty tough schedule last year, in my opinion. You look at who they played in the non-conference. They played Eastern Illinois, Kansas out of the Big 12, and Central Michigan. So not a tough non-conference schedule, but they beat Kansas. I mean, that was a revenge game there from last year, from 2023, and they did beat them at home. And I feel like after that game, that was kind of, setting the tone for Illinois the rest of the way. We kind of knew this would be a really good team the rest of the way. And after that Nebraska win here on the road, that was probably just setting the tone for them. They started out 4-0. But you look at who they played in the Big Ten last year. They played Purdue, Michigan, Minnesota, and Michigan State all at home. And then on the road, they played Nebraska, Penn State, Oregon, and then Rutgers and Northwestern. So they lost to Penn State by a couple of touchdowns, got blown out by Oregon, and then lost to Minnesota at home. That was kind of a disappointing loss there, especially losing at home. But yeah, with this schedule, Illinois was able to go 9-3 last year, and again, they were a big surprise team. Let's now look ahead to 2025. This is the schedule for Illinois for 2025, and before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Illinois plays in the non-conference this year. So this is their non-conference schedule. They will play Western Illinois on the road at Duke, and then Western Michigan. So a couple of cupcake games, and then you got Duke here on the road, which really could be an exciting non-conference game. This is kind of a battle here between two of the surprise teams from last year. The Blue Devils were also a big surprise. This is another team that I was not really high on. So yeah, both of these teams, this kind of feels like a battle between the two surprise teams from last year. And I think the winner of this game probably could be that surprise team for 2025. So that's your non-conference schedule, not so tough whatsoever. Let's now move on to the home Big Ten schedule for Illinois. They'll play 4 home games this year in the Big Ten. They'll play USC, Ohio State, Rutgers, and Northwestern. So you look at 3 out of these 4 games, they're all pretty winnable games. USC, Rutgers, and Northwestern. Ohio State obviously going to be the really tough one against the defending national champions. But the good news for Illinois is it is a home game, so that is the really good news against the Buckeyes. Not saying that Illinois has a really good shot in this game. I think they have a really good shot. I mean, don't get me wrong, Illinois can pull off an upset here, but it's going to be very tough, even playing at home. So not a tough home schedule here for Illinois, but they have to play the Buckeyes this year, which honestly will be very tough even when it's at home. So let's now move on to the away schedule. They'll play 4 away games in the Big Ten. They'll play Indiana, Purdue, Washington, and Wisconsin. All 4 of these games will be on the road. Of course, Indiana was a big surprise team from last year. Purdue actually was a pretty close game last year. If you look back at that game, that game went into so many overtimes, and then also it was a shootout between these two teams. Illinois won, but it was really a close game. And then you got Washington and Wisconsin, 2 very tough places to play. Wisconsin definitely always a pretty tough place to play as always. But this is not a bad road schedule in my opinion. These are all 4 winnable games for Illinois. That really, these are kind of like close matchups to be honest. But yeah, these are your away games. It's not really a tough road schedule. I think playing Ohio State at home also probably is a really favorable kind of thing for Illinois as well. So let's now go back to the schedule here and go full game by game now. Again, they start with Western Illinois on August 30th. Then it's a road game at Duke on September the 6th. Again, a very interesting non-conference game. And then they'll play Western Michigan at home on September 13th. So they play all 3 of their non-conference games to kick off the season. And then they open up Big Ten play here on the road at Indiana on September the 20th. USC at home on September 27th. Then they go on the road to play Purdue on October the 4th. Then there's that big game against Ohio State at home on October the 11th. Again, that is a game that's going to be very tough for Illinois, but they'll have a great shot to maybe pull off the upset. And then they get a bye week here before playing Washington on the road on October 25th. Then they play Rutgers at home on November 1st. Then they get their second bye week before playing Maryland at home on November 15th. And then it's on the road at Wisconsin on November 22nd. And then they close things out with Northwestern at home on November 29th. So this schedule is not horrible for Illinois. I mean, they don't have to play Penn State. They don't have to play Oregon, which I think is really good news. But you got Indiana on the schedule. I mean, that game is on the road, of course, but I think it's definitely a pretty even matchup. Again, you got the Buckeyes at home. That's going to be a pretty tough game there, even when it's at home. And then you got a couple of tough road games with Washington and Wisconsin. But all in all, this is a schedule that really kind of sets up nicely for Illinois. Not saying they're going to be a Big Ten contender or anything, but this is a schedule that kind of sets up well for them. So let's now get a projection here for Illinois for 2025. This is the scale I'll be using here for their projection. And if it's a 1% game in the red, again, that's a game or those are games where Illinois has no chance whatsoever. Again, those games count as automatic losses. And then your 20% games in the orange will be games where Illinois will be a double-digit underdog by 10 to 14 points, also known as a couple of touchdowns. And then your 40% games in the yellow will be games where Illinois will be a clear underdog in by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then your 50-50 games will, of course, stay in the white, games that really can go either way. Your 60% games in the purple will be games where Illinois will be favored by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, just like the yellow games. And then just like the blue games, or I should say the orange games, the blue games are going to be games where Illinois will be favored by double digits, also known as a couple of touchdowns by 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then your 99% games in the green, those are your automatic wins. So we'll start with that percentage here first. Your easy wins here for Illinois, I think you've got a couple of them on here, Western Illinois and Western Michigan. 2 out of your 3 non-conference games, these are 2 games where Illinois should be big favorites in by like 17 plus or 20 plus points, somewhere in that particular range. And I think these games are definitely over that 95 to 99% mark. I definitely could see this game as being close to like 99%, to be honest. And again, these are 2 games where Illinois definitely should have no business of losing. These are 2 games that are not guaranteed wins, but we count them as automatic wins here in this projection for 2025. So that is where I think Illinois will win pretty easily. Let's now move on to the next percentage, the games where I think Illinois will be favored by double digits, also known as a couple of touchdowns, and that is in the blue. And I got a couple of them, Maryland and Northwestern. I think Illinois will be favored by double digits in both of these games by 10 to 14 points. Look, I know Maryland is a team that's been kind of consistent throughout the Big Ten, and Illinois definitely should be like close to a 50-50 game with them. But, you know, Maryland wasn't really good last year, and based off of how the teams finish, I'm going to put that game in the blue for right now just because it's at home for Illinois. And then same thing for Northwestern. They're not really consistent as a program. They weren't really good last year, so I don't really know how good both of these teams are going to be. That's the reason why they both end up in the blue. So yeah, both of these games, I think Illinois will be favored in both of them by at least a couple of touchdowns, like 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then I got one game here in the purple where I think Illinois is going to be favored by 6 or 7 points by about a touchdown, and that's Purdue on the road. So because of being on the road and everything, that's the reason why it's also in the purple. And then also the reason why it's in the purple is because of how close the game was from last year. If this game was probably at home for Illinois, I probably would still put it in the purple, but maybe even in the blue. I don't really know just yet. I don't really know how good the Boilermakers are going to be this year because they do have a first-year head coach, so I don't really know how good they're going to be. But this game was pretty close last year, and with it being on the road, that's the reason why it ended up being in the purple for me instead of like the blue. So I think that one game there, I think Illinois will be favored at least by 6 or 7 or 8 points by about a touchdown, somewhere in that particular range. And then we go on to the games where I think Illinois is going to be an underdog in. I don't have any games in the red or orange, but I got one game in the yellow where I think Illinois will be a clear underdog in, and that is the home game against Ohio State. So I think Illinois will be a touchdown underdog against the Buckeyes by 6, 7, or 8 points, somewhere in that particular range. And the reason why it's in the yellow is because it's at home. So it does give Illinois a pretty good shot to pull off the upset. Again, not saying they're going to, but they do have a pretty good shot here to maybe pull off the upset. You never know. Upsets happen all the time in college football, but this would definitely be a big shocker if maybe Illinois does pull off the upset. I would be very surprised by it. But maybe at the same time, maybe not surprised by it. Maybe I am not surprised that they'll probably pull off the upset, but I don't know if I see it happening. But again, as of right now, I think Illinois will be a touchdown underdog by 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that particular range against the defending national champions, the Ohio State Buckeyes. And then that leaves you with 6 50-50 games. Duke, Indiana, USC, Washington, Rutgers, and Wisconsin. These are all 6 50-50 games that really can go either way. Duke, obviously, I just talked about it. This is like a battle between two surprise teams from last year. Indiana's a pretty even matchup. USC also a pretty even matchup. Washington, Rutgers, and Wisconsin. All these games are pretty even matchups in my opinion for Illinois. So let's say they win 3 out of the 6. That does give me, get to my projected record now here for Illinois. So again, based off of how the teams were from last year, what does the projected record come out to be? And based on this schedule, we count the green games as wins, the blue games as wins as well. And then you average out that one purple game at 60%. Same thing with Ohio State here at 40% in the yellow. And then they split these 50-50 games. Let's say they win 3 out of the 6 50-50 games. That's going to give you a projection of 8-4. So that is what the projected record looks like here for Illinois for 2025. Again, if you split these 50-50 games, that's going to give you 3 out of the 6 wins, and then you lose 3 of those 50-50 games. But maybe they slip up, maybe against Purdue. Maybe they also lose to Ohio State. You never know. That 4th loss could probably come to either one of those teams. But yeah, that is what the projected record looks like for Illinois. I think worst case scenario, probably 7-5. Best case, 9-3. But again, I don't know how good Illinois is going to be this year. They were really good last year, but maybe this year they're not really good. They go back and forth, like I mentioned. It seems like they're really good the last year, and then they're not really good the next year. And then the next year, they're really good again. So we don't know how good this team is going to be, but as of right now, based on how tough this schedule is, the projected record comes out to be 8-4 for this Illinois team. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let me know down in the comments below, and also give me your thoughts about Illinois' schedule. Is it tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.